period, and they bear on the current tensions in the United Methodist Church. In 1766, 3 immigrant lay preachers and 1 immigrant lay woman introduced Methodism to America. By 1784, there were 170 preachers, almost all of them young lay men, and they founded in that year the Methodist Episcopal Church. Episcopal because we have episcopoi or bishops. Their design was to reform the continent and spread scriptural holiness over these lands. And scriptural holiness was love. And they helped to stimulate what later became known as the Second Great Awakening. The term refers to the spread of a style of evangelism known as revivalism. It had swept over some of the American colonies a half-century earlier. Now it was continuing, and the Methodists were major players. Revivalism transformed American Methodism from a small movement of lay people into the nation's largest denomination. In the early years, the revivals were times of frenzy, ecstasy, agony. The preaching was loud, extemporaneous, disorganized. The cries and shouts from the listeners were louder, more disorganized. The people cried out, they pleaded, they groaned, they fell to the ground, they confessed their sins, they endured agonies, they praised God, they sang, they rejoiced, they sometimes jerked backwards and forwards or swayed to each side or raised their arms to heavens. Brent, do we have the picture on the screen? Great. The Methodist preacher, Peter Cartwright, once described seeing 500 people simultaneously jerking. And Brent, let's take that down. That gave you a sense of it, but it destroyed my script as well. So I'm afraid that I fall dumb. I do not fall to the ground, but I fall dumb without it. Cartwright described 500 people simultaneously jerking. To see these proud young gentlemen and young ladies dressed in their silks, jewelry, and prunella from top to toe take the jerks would often excite my risibilities. The first jerk or so, you would see their fine bonnets, caps, and combs fly, and so sudden would be the jerking of the head that their long, loose hair would crack almost as loud as a wagoner's whip. Much of the frenzy took place in an American adaptation of a Scottish and Northern Irish institution, which in America was called the camp meeting. Families came from miles around. They camped in tents or wagons. They cooked their foods in hundreds of wild in hundreds of campfires. They stayed 4 or 5 days, sometimes 2 or 3 preachers, sometimes 5 or 8 preached with several sermons a day, sometimes delivered simultaneously from different preaching stands. Brent, let's have that picture again and just let people see this view of a camp meeting. You can see in the background the tents in which people have the tents that people have brought to stay in for an extended period of time. Here you see one preaching stand. Sometimes there were 3 or 4. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see one man who's fallen, slain in the spirit. Quite often there were more people being slain in the spirit than this picture shows. Okay, Brent, you can take that down. Other denominations had camp meetings, but Methodists especially adopted the institution as their own. Bishop Asbury called it Methodism's harvest time. He said that the revivals of 1805 made that year the greatest year that was ever known in America or in the world. And in 1811, he wrote in his journal that there would be at least 400 such camp meetings during that one year. Now, when the Methodists took up the camp meetings, they eventually organized them. They set schedules. They protected boundaries. They patrolled the grounds. They threw out the mockers who came to ridicule. And when they left the camp meeting, they organized new congregations, small groups, women's guilds, love feasts, midweek prayer meetings, classes, conferences. Some of those institutions had been brought from England. Some of them originated in America. Don Matthews at the University of North Carolina has argued that the revivals led to the most significant organization of women seen up to that time in American history. It drew them into small groups where they could bond and have a sense of their own agency. The Methodists called each other father, mother, brother, sister, and they formed a bond of union and hundreds of new congregations. There were 73,000 Methodists by 1800, 250,000 by 1820, 500,000 by 1830, and by 1844, 1,170,000. In 1866, an author in Harper's Magazine wrote that Methodism had become, for good or ill, the predominant ecclesiastical fact of the nation. And the revival, at least for a time, it's upset an order in which wealth and prestige and race and sex dictated who were powerful. The new birth and the Methodist striving for perfect love broke into the system of traditional power relationships and confused those relationships. But by the 1840s, The Methodists were growing in respectability. They built larger and more ornate churches with organs and rented pews and steeples. And they founded colleges and universities, including Indiana Asbury, later Indiana University, Drew, Wesleyan Northwestern, Syracuse, Duke, Emory. White Methodists, though, made their peace with the enslavement of Africans, and they divided over politics. In 1845, you know that they divided into northern and southern churches. And some of them at least became very much at home in a society in which there were vast differences of wealth, and some of them were among the wealthy. But some of them didn't feel at home in that society, and they sparked the second moment of renewal through service. The renewal, the Methodist form of the social gospel, began again with the women. In 1868, Annie Wittenmeyer formed a Methodist society to send women to evangelize among the poor in the cities. And in 1885, Lucy Ryder Meyer established the Chicago Training School to train deaconesses who would work in the inner city. They took the idea from the Germans, who had also created deaconesses. And these women went from tenement to tenement, where people slept sometimes 10 to a room, simply helping people and gathering systematic information about their plight. It was a ministry of service to the poor in the worst sections of Chicago and eventually Louisville and Kansas City and Nashville and other cities. And within 3 years, the General Conference recognized the deaconess movement as a ministry of the wider church. Clergy began to follow their example. Reverdy Ransom, a member in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded the Institutional Church and Settlement House in Chicago. An institutional church was one of the distinctive products of the social gospel. In an institutional church, people in poor neighborhoods learned how to sew, how to cook, how to read, how to speak English, how to learn skills for jobs. Goodwill Industries began as a Methodist institutional church. In 1908, the new Methodist Federation for Social Service, founded the year before, brought to the General Conference a statement that later became known as the Methodist Social Creed. 4 years later, the Federal Council of Churches, the forerunner of the National Council of Churches, adopted the social creed on behalf of all its member churches. The social creed, it was given that name by a Methodist minister who helped to write it. And let's get it up on the screen now, Brent, and let people get a sense of what was in it. The social creed talked about equal rights, complete justice, abolition of child labor, regulation of the conditions of toil for women, the suppression of the sweating system, which was a system in which people would be paid by piecework that they did in their homes rather than paid a living salary. For the gradual and reasonable reduction of the hours of labor to the lowest practical point, for the release from employment. Oh, by the way, reasonable reduction of the hours of labor. The standard hours of labor per week in the factory system in the late 19th century was 60 hours a week. For release from employment 1 day in 7, that was 60 hours a week, 7 days a week. For the right of workers to some protection against hardships resulting from swift crises of industrial change, for a living wage, for suitable protection for the old age of the workers, for the abatement of poverty. All right, Brent, we can take that one down. It was a highly controversial document in 1908, but by 1914, the Southern branch of the church adopted it, and the Northern church began to move even beyond it. In the 1920s, it added statements on the economy, racial relations, international norms. The Northern General Conference even spoke out in favor of labor unions, which was indeed a daring move at that time. It might even be a daring move in our time. Bishop Francis McConnell, one of the lions of the social gospel, chaired the national committee that examined the long and bloody strike at U.S. Steel, and that committee came out in favor of the workers. And after the stock market crash of 1929, the General Conference during the 1930s began to raise fundamental questions about the economic order. This statement from 1932, the present industrial order is unchristian, unethical, and unsocial. The profit motive must be subordinate to the creative and cooperative spirit. Now, the reaction from conservatives was sharp and sustained. From the right, everyone from the House Un-American Activities Committee to Reader's Digest brought the Methodists under siege. Eventually, by the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin went after Methodist Bishop G. Brumley Oxnam for being a communist. And the Reader's Digest talked about Methodism's pink fringe. From the left, realist theologians contended that the theology of the social gospel needed to be far more sophisticated about both sin and social power. But the social gospel left a mark on the denomination. The social creed is still in the discipline in an expanded form. The denomination continues to take social positions. It still has a general board of church and society with offices in Washington, D.C., a block from the Supreme Court building. And congregations like Glen still reflect some of the social gospel's spirit. And finally, there was a third period of renewal that I'll call reorganization. In 1913, a speaker at a Methodist event claimed that the watchwords of Methodism were unification, cooperation, and coordination. Even before the Civil War, the Methodists were known for their agility of organization. Starting in 1819, they organized mission societies and tract societies and women's societies and devotional societies and Sunday school societies and colleges and anti-slavery societies and temperance societies. This couldn't match, however, the restructuring of the denomination after the Civil War and extending up to the present. The sheer proliferation of organizations in the late 19th and early 20th century. Foreign mission organizations, home mission organizations, social reform organizations, youth organizations, women's organizations, temperance societies, more temperance societies. And by temperance, they meant total abstinence from alcohol. And this era of new organizations was followed by what some have called the Great Consolidation. This began in 1904 when the General Conference tried to reduce the number of boards to 3: foreign missions, home missions, and Sunday school and education. This was too drastic a step. And by 1920, there were again 10 boards, all competing with one another for funds. So during the 1920s, the church made the General Conference supreme over all the phases of denominational life. One of the delegates proclaimed, "Jesus said go," and the result is organized going. The church as a body obeying the command of its master and head. But the boards still competed for money, so the General Conference created a General Commission on Finance, the predecessor to the General Council on Finance and Administration. And this was the beginning of central financial administration in the Methodist Episcopal Church North. Now, this is boring stuff. Tinkering with the machinery, But sometimes renewal has come through tinkering with the machinery. By 1939, the church was ready for more organizational mergers. In that year, the Methodist Episcopal Church North, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and the Protestant Methodist Church united to form the Methodist Church. This was good, but it wasn't all good. Critics were disturbed that the new church isolated its African American churches in their own segregated central jurisdiction. But the Southern Church made that a condition of union. And when the uniting conference stood to sing, "We are marching to Zion," at the conclusion, Black delegates remained sitting, and some of them cried. Institutional reorganization had created a new Methodism. Brent, let's just get a glance at that conference session. This was the final day of the session. You can get a sense of the vastness of the representation. You also get a sense of the way in which American Methodism was merging more and more with American culture. So instead of a cross over the central podium, there was an American flag. Okay, Brent, that's good. When the Methodist Church then joined with the evangelical United Brethren Church to form the United Methodist Church in 1968, the segregated central jurisdiction was eliminated. So institutional reorganization had created a new Methodism. But by that time, confidence in institutional structures was beginning to wane in the church and in American society. By the end of the 1990s, Tom Frank, who many of you know, Tom observed that for many United Methodist members, the national body is the they or the them of bloated bureaucracy that has lost touch with us, the silent majority. And today, the Good News Caucus still presents itself as the voice of the laity and of conservative politics and doctrine against the institutional hierarchy. That's their term. So there are many Methodisms today, and one is the Methodism of the 18th century revival. It's still intact, even if it is less exuberant and demonstrative. Another is the Methodism of the social gospel, though without the energy and optimism of the original social gospel. And they exist within the same renewed institution that emerged from that 1968 reorganization. And we look to be on the verge of yet one more institutional renewal. The 1968 version will probably not hold together, and the result might be further Methodist decline, accelerated by our divisions, or the result might be the beginnings of still further renewal, as each Methodism is freed to experiment with its own understanding of the gospel and its implications. That is my text of the day, and we can now open the meeting for your comments, questions, observations, insights, consternation. Let's see. I can see some of you. Let me put this in gallery view and see more of you. And therefore can see some of you. Do you have any comments? Do you have any insights that you'd like to add to this? Any corrections that you'd like to make to it from your own experience? We'd love to hear from you.
The only general conference that I went to was in, what was that? Dallas, Fort Worth. And I was amazed. I had not realized how much voice and freedom of speech was being practiced. This is definitely more radical than any other organized Christian organization I'd ever seen. I've been to large conferences in the Baptist church. I saw that really the committees and all the things that they have is not as transparent. And it could be that really based on political observations that all of us know are going on, the Methodists are much more, I think, freedom of speech bound. They know that they have to be in conversation with everyone that has a vested interest in the outcome. I think it's a wonderful reflection that we have a healthy system of trying to be transparent, but of course we all suspect that there are a lot of decisions that are made in the darkened shadows of some cigar-filled room or something, I don't know, but I don't think that's true. At least many of the people who are so much in leadership, I'm just amazed. I don't know, maybe some other people have other reflections. Maybe I'm a Pollyanna here.
Thanks, Ron. Are there other reflections? Certainly the General Conference is an attempt to be a democratic church, a church in which as many people as possible have a voice.
Brooks, this is Betty Asbury.
Hi, Betty.
I would like to go much further back than Ron has. And Wesleyan College was created the same year that Emory College was created, 1836. I would like for you to add it to its list, your list that you gave, because it is the first college which granted degrees to women. And Methodism can be very proud of that. And I hate for you to leave it out.
Well, thanks, Betty. That's really a thoughtful and important addition to this. And if I ever give this talk again, which I doubt that I will, I'll be sure to include it. The Methodists founded scores of colleges and universities. Many of them failed, but many of them have endured.
Brooks, I have many observations. This is a very rich topic for conversation. I wish we could have several sessions on this, but I'd have to say that the more things change, the more they stay the same. General agencies are still fighting with each other over funding. It gets even more bloody in the face of radical budget cuts in anticipation of schism. So since the beginning of time, I guess the agencies have been competing for attention and funding, and that still goes on, obviously.
That's good insight, Gerald. Thanks.
Hey,
Brooks
this is
is- Go ahead.
I'm
is
sorry, I
Mary
couldn't.
Lou.
Mary Lou?
Yes, hey, good morning. I
Hi.
have to echo Gerald in the fight for funds and for meaning throughout the church right now and in the past. I'm sort of on the Betty Asbury line, though. I wanted to mention that Boston University, I wanted to mention that the Deaconess movement in Boston led to the establishment of the School of Religious Education at Boston University, which then became the School of Social Work, which is now a highly ranked School of Social Work in the university system. And for me, I did a paper on that several years ago, and it was really exciting to see the role that church women played and the way that their efforts were able to become institutionalized and become part of an educational system. So like the Chicago Institute and Garrett Evangelical Seminary, it's really an exciting bit of our history that not very many people know about. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Brooks, I was wondering about the AME church. How did it split off and at what point?
It split off almost from its inception, and that was early in the 19th century. It began when Richard, someone help me.
Alan?
Allen,
No.
thank you, Don. Don always comes to my rescue. When Richard Allen left the old St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia because he was thrown out as a result of not sitting in the proper place. And that was very early in the 19th century. The AME then grew and especially expanded after the Civil War because it attracted African Americans who were more interested in what we might call a social gospel than were the Africans who founded the African Americans who founded the CMEs, which was at that time it was founded in 1870, so it was founded later, but it tended to be more on the revival side of the spectrum. So the African American churches have seen, I think, the same dynamic of some being more inclined toward service and reform, some being more inclined toward internality and piety.
Thank you.
Brooks?
Mhm.
Brooks, I want to go back to that image that in some ways startled me again. It's the image of the American flag at the center of Kiel Auditorium at the final session of 1968, the
No,
foundation.
1939.
Oh, that was 39, yes.
That was 39. It
Yeah,
was.
maybe by the time of 1968, we actually had a cross at the United Methodist Church. Was that true? Would that be
I
true?
don't think that I don't know. I wasn't at 68.
Okay.
But I'm quite sure there was in 68, there was no great American flag overhanging the proceedings. If there would have been anything in 68, it would have been a cross, I think.
Yeah, well, it just stirred in my mind the current problems of anti-institutionalism. And of course, we've seen in this last year an eruption of anti-democratic, at least in the organizational side of our country. But I think that has affected and affected Methodism's confidence in its institutional structures. Would you say that in a sense we're breathing the toxic atmosphere of a really sustained anti-institutionalism and anti-intellectualism? That's a devastation combination. Its effect on the United Methodist Church at this point is, how would you assess that, Brooke?
Well, I think Tom's right that we've seen, if you compare this with either 1939 or 1968, there's simply no comparison in the distrust of institutions. And I think that reflects a lot that's going on and has gone on in the country, but it's really hurt. It's really hurt the church, I think.
Yeah. What it does for me is say that the impetus for especially the social commitments to justice and so on has had to kind of devolve into local congregations. I mean, we do have Susan Henry Crow fighting valiantly with the banner in Washington, D.C. and so on, but we've lost a kind of confidence in the organizational ability of the church to speak definitively and forcefully in the public domain. Or am I wrong on that?
Well, that building in Washington, D.C. is a good example, a good symbol of what you're talking about, because that building was erected with great fanfare. It was on extremely valuable land. It was filled to the brim with Methodists working for the General Board of Church and Society. And now the Methodists rent out most of that space. They still own the building and still occupy it as a general board, but most of the space is rented out to other institutions, other groups. So I think that's where we are. We have time for one more, and then it'll be 10:20, and that's my assigned termination.
Brooks, I can't let you go without asking if you think now or anticipate that the energies of the Good News Movement and the Wesleyan Covenant Association and the global church will ultimately be less bureaucratic and less institutional than what we already know as the United Methodist Church now.
Probably for the first 5 or 6 years, but it will institutionalize quickly, and as it does, it will gather the same number of competing interests and
Okay, so how do we live in this liminal space? As a historian, you've seen renewal movements, and you can speak about the forces that led to them. We're clearly part of what you've labeled as a renewal movement. how do we individually live in this space?
Well, I think we probably live in it differently at different times. And that right now, this sounds flip, but I would say that the best way we live in our institutions right now is to live in them humbly, with modest expectations, but with a hope that the future always brings possibilities that we can't now see. And so, we live in hope. We do live in humility, and we're part of Methodism's history in America was its triumphalism in the mid 20th century. We do not suffer today from triumphalism. We suffer from discouragement. But to live with humility and hope, that's about the best we can do. Well, it is now 10:21, so I'm 1 minute over my assigned time, and I will say a brief prayer, and we can then go our separate ways. Would you pray? For renewal in the past, for the ever-present possibility of renewal, for the renewal we've experienced in moments of our own lives, for the greater good that we've seen in the way in which larger groupings of people can create a new future. We give thee thanks. For our many shortcomings, we express our penitence. And we ask for mercy in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.